Welcome to today's program titled Special Delivery, Unwelcome Outreach from the Government, Part 1, Love Letters from EVerify, Complexities and Nuances. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down, as it will not be reread and it is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials, along with the CLE attendance form, will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. On the next slide, you will see a legal disclaimer. At this time, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker for today's program, Leon Rodriguez. Leon, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be having the opportunity this afternoon to talk about EVerify and some of the risks, unseen risks that can go with EVerify use. I am joined today by my colleagues, Dawn Lurie and Zach Perez. Dawn in particular is one of the national experts in the area of immigration compliance, I-9 preparation, and EVerify utilization, having been in this area for literally decades. And Zach as well is part of our team and is going to be talking to you today about state level involvement with the EVerify system. As we start our discussion today, I'm reminded by a movie that some of you probably have watched called Troy. I imagine there are probably a handful of Brad Pitt fans in the audience today. And this was the story of the attack on Troy. And the way that attack was conducted was that the invaders built a giant wooden horse that they were presenting as a gift to the people of Troy. And that was seen as a gift by the people of Troy. But in fact, hidden inside that horse were hundreds, literally hundreds of invading soldiers who ultimately took over the city of Troy. And departing from that extreme example, some could look at EVerify as kind of a Trojan horse. It can seem benign. You can use it, it works, it tells you whether people are authorized to work, it doesn't seem like a lot of trouble. But in fact, there are some risks associated with it about which you should be aware. And so if we can skip over to slide 5. And we can start by talking a little bit about what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now, and how the overall immigration compliance system is being seen by the current administration. There was a memo that was issued by Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, a good number of, actually about a year ago, that talked not in terms of DHS's immigration enforcement program, talking about maximizing the impact of their efforts, focusing in particular on unscrupulous employers and also activities where unscrupulous employers create an unfair labor market. And this goes beyond just, if you read the rest of the Mayorkas memo, this goes beyond just immigration violations, but in fact goes to look at labor violations and other kinds of violations of law that you would associate with labor exploitation. Going on to the next slide. Um, this is something that we have seen not just in Secretary Mayorkas's memo, but it's also generally what you hear people talking about in DC. And so we've got to look at the different things that are going on here. You have USCIS. It's an agency that I actually worked for a number of years. That with respect to EVerify really attempts to have a customer service approach in its interactions with EVerify users. It wants to make it invest, in fact, considerable resources in making it easily accessible to employers, easy to use, and works to encourage employers to use it and seeks to implement the EVerify system in a way that is employer friendly. And this is something that has certainly been continued by the current administration. On the other hand, you do have a pretty significant focus as well on protection of workers and combating labor exploitation. And so, while on the other hand, on one hand, EVerify can be seen as a way to ease the process of employers verifying the employment eligibility of their employees, and in fact can be, and this is what we want to explore with you today and enable you to make informed decisions about how and when you use EVerify. It can also be used, and the data from it can be used in order to pursue what at least are suspected to be employers who are in some way out of compliance with various laws, including those that are meant to protect workers. Dawn, I know that there's been a call for review of EVerify, and I know this is something that you've been certainly involved as an advocate and stakeholder based on all your experience. Can you tell us a little bit about what those calls for review entail?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, this administration is focused not only on the labor exploitation, but certainly also the modernization and reducing employer burden. And accordingly, they are looking, for employer feedback and looking to see, what type of recommendations the agencies themselves are able to come up with to improve the experience across the board. So we're gonna hit on some of those things. You can go to the next slide so that we can. Yeah, Liam, why don't you just give an overview?
So yeah, no, I think it's important, to answer what is EVerify, because I think especially if you hear politicians talk about EVerify, it is absolutely one of the most powerful tools in the history of immigration enforcement. In fact, it has a very specific and very limited purpose that doesn't go nearly as far intrinsically as some might suspect. And so what EVerify is meant to do is to enable employers to electronically confirm their employees' eligibility to work in the United States based on the documents presented to them by those employees. And so the EVerify employers can verify the identity and employment eligibility. They can take the information that they've used to do that and submit it to EVerify. But it's always worth understanding that if those documents are problematic, and certainly Dawn, Zach, and I, and undoubtedly some of you see this every day, if those documents are problematic, then the outcome of EVerify as well will be problematic. And so it's important to understand what this system does and doesn't do as we talk about it, and as we see the other ways in which other sort of enforcement mechanisms are plugged into EVerify. It is administered by U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the benefit adjudication agency within the Department of Homeland Security. It's not an enforcement agency, although some might argue that it does have certain enforcement components. It really is a benefit adjudication agency. Enforcement, of course, is carried on by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And the use of EVerify continues to grow. There are more than 1 million participating employer, over 1.2 million enrolled in Memoranda of Understanding, all for a combined total of 3 million hiring sites across the country. And we can certainly tell you from our experience that we're hearing from clients every day who either determine that they have to, and we're going to talk about those situations where they have to enroll in EVerify, or have decided that it makes sense for their business to at least consider enrolling in EVerify. And of course, it cuts across all kinds of employers, all kinds of industries, all kinds of business sizes. All of that. It's a very widely used, and worth noting at this point that there is interest among many in the political world, and in fact broadening the mandatory use of EVerify. And in fact, there are some who advocate for universal EVerify for all employers. Dawn, great opportunity now, I think, to talk about the new initiatives we've been hearing about to modernize not only EVerify, but the overall I-9 system.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, in a perfect world, we would have seen modernization efforts accelerated over, the past 10 years. Definitely, there was first what was called transformation of EVerify, and that actually happened when Secretary Mayorkas was the USCIS director. He very much focused on improvements to EVerify. He had heard about the complaints, including the high error rates and whatnot. And there were a lot of resources that were dedicated. And of course, there's a lot of money because it's a funded program. And now, again, we're seeing these modernization efforts. We do know that the Immigration Service is working on particular initiatives. One of them is the next generation of EVerify, where they are looking to make improvements to the employee experience and the employer experience. We would love to see a fully electronic integrated I-9 and EVerify option. I don't think that we're going to see that fully completed, but I think that the next generation is definitely, working towards something like that, so that employers, again, so the burden is reduced, and that there may be some certain or a way to kind of pre-clear someone, so to have their information reviewed, similar to the way an employee can use the EVerify system, which is a direct system where you can actually look at the information that's in EVerify, your own information. So I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know how quickly it's going to happen, but I know there's a lot of resources, there's a lot of focus on it, and we are excited to continue to watch that and to help the government in any way to improve that system. But there's a lot to go into that. I know all the agencies have eyes on it. One of the particularly interesting things that I had heard about was a tentative non-confirmation process that was owned more by the employee. We'll talk a little bit about TNCs later on, but that's basically when you have, the query comes back and the government cannot verify the information, either through the Social Security Administration or through the Department of Homeland Security. And right now, the employer is very much involved. There's responsibilities and timelines and getting the employee to sign things and talking to them in private. And at the end of the day, it's not an employer problem, right? Because whatever this mismatch is has nothing to do, assuming that the employer has input the data correctly and all the information has been checked. So this is, pretty exciting that the employee will be able to own this process and to be able to clean it up in some way. So again, we don't have all the details, but it's definitely something that makes sense. In terms of the expansion of EVerify that you mentioned, again, depending upon politics or states or interests, people have different opinions on whether or not EVerify should be mandated. There's concerns about the use of the system electronically, whether or not all employers have accessibility, whether there are accessibility issues for certain employers and whatnot. But definitely, it's something that the service would like to expand. And one of the ways that we might see it expand is in the context of virtual I-9s. After the pandemic happened, there was acceleration on the concept of virtual I-9s. And when I say virtual I-9s, what I mean by that is basically being able to review the identity and work authorization documents of somebody virtually on a call like this without having the person in front of you to physically inspect and touch the documents. There is a COVID exemption right now for certain employers that are able to do this for employees that are still working remotely because of COVID, not just because they're working remotely. And there's a lot of strings attached, if you will, to the COVID exemption. And right now, the biggest string is that when people come back to work, you will have to redo and actually physically inspect. So the service, we've worked very closely and have been advocating an enormous amount to have them consider this and putting all the gates in place and ensuring that the identity is verified and whatnot. So we're finally at a place where we know that it's under consideration. We recently, the rule is making its way up. At the beginning, we knew it was at the White House for consideration. I think that there will be a notice and comment period. I'm really proud of the advocacy efforts at Seyfarth and others, including organizations such as SHRM, the Chamber, ALA, have really, put into this. And I think we're getting to where we need to go. I think that EVerify may be mandated. So in other words, if you want to use virtual I-9s, there may be, you might have to also be a member of EVerify. You might have to copy all your documents, A, B, and C, be a member of EVerify, participate in it across the board if you want to partake in this. So it'll be something that we want to watch and see. At the beginning, there was a discussion about using, in order to participate in this, using the Immigration and Customs Enforcement's image program, which EVerify is the best practice and part of, but has a lot of other strings attached. I think that maybe that's not going to go through. I don't even know if ICE could handle the influx of new participants. EVerify is set up to onboard a much larger number. So Leon, we're going to watch and wait and certainly keep our clients updated on that. Next slide, please. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yep, no, I was going to say exactly what you said, which is, certainly this group can count on that. As that happens, we'll have another one of these to talk exactly about how the things you may want to consider in making that decision as to whether to pursue.
That's right. That's right. EVerify is, and we've talked about this, EVerify is not for everyone, but we appreciate the government's ongoing ability or interest in engaging stakeholders. I think, again, that messaging comes from the top. Secretary Mayorkas has said to engage often and early. I'm probably misquoting him. All right, we're going to talk about voluntary participation. And while we're going to move to the next slide, but maybe if you could launch that poll in the meantime, and I can certainly start chatting. We'd like to get some information on our participants. Great. You'll see that on the right-hand side, I think. Do you currently use EVerify? Yes or no? If you can respond to that, we would appreciate that. All right. So as Leon said, does everybody want to use EVerify? For the most part, EVerify is still voluntary. There are some exceptions. If you are a federal contractor or a federal subcontractor, with certain exemptions, you may need to use EVerify. You may be forced in order to comply and do business with the government. There are also state requirements. There can be local requirements, and there are other benefits to being a voluntary participant, including the STEM optional practical training program for F1 foreign students. In order for these particular students to extend their stay and their ability to work, they basically can obtain a 24-month extension to do more practical training after they graduate from a United States university in the STEM field. In order to be able to get that extension, they must be working for an employer that uses EVerify. So that's something that maybe you may be asked to enroll in EVerify because you have a STEM candidate. I'm going to stop here because I don't know if we're going to have an opportunity later on, and I don't want to miss out on this. I want to talk about, whether or not you want to enroll your entire organization or even a site or whatever in EVerify just because you have one STEM candidate or even a small group of STEM candidates. This is something that you should think about carefully. You should also make sure that you have processes and protocols in place that do not allow for somebody, in one of your locations to enroll and to sign an MOU. I can't tell you how many companies do not think that they're enrolled in EVerify or don't think they're enrolled in certain states in EVerify. And then they find out that they are because an HR or sometimes even an administrative person went in and signed an MOU. MOUs with the government should be taken very seriously, and they should be done very carefully with consideration. So while being able to support a STEM OPT student may be important, this is a larger conversation that must be had. So in terms of risks and benefits, and this is part of the conversation, why would you want to sign up? Look, it is considered excuse me, it is considered a best practice, both by USCIS and really, for the government overall. I will say that, just to note that there are some individuals, especially within Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security, that are very vocal about the quality or the actual end result of EVerify. They know that there's a lot of kinks in the armor, which we'll continue to talk about. But generally speaking, the EVerify rules themselves, if you comply with the EVerify rules, they help you to become more compliant, generally speaking, in your I-9 practices. That's definitely something to consider. EVerify is free, in terms of, there's no cost to enroll with the government. There are other costs to consider, but there is no cost. If you were to be audited by the government, generally speaking, employers that are using EVerify and have historically used EVerify, generally speaking, will have a lower fine violation number. That doesn't mean that just because you're using EVerify, for the past 6 months, that's going to help. But over time, it helps to clean a workforce, and it also helps you to ensure that you're completing your forms correctly, because the form itself is the data that's actually dumped into EVerify. And if there's a problem with it, EVerify will alert you to some of those. Use of EVerify can just generally mitigate risk in the event of a government investigation. First of all, it's a deterrent for unlawful individuals without work authorization to be applying for jobs. You need to post it when individuals are applying for jobs. So that is, definitely something to, to think about. And it increases the likelihood that you will, again, you'll do the right thing on your I-9. We already talked about the benefits of the STEM OPT. And in the course of, let's say your company is being sold in an M&A transaction or a restructuring, it's a good look there as well, right? Companies like to know that other companies are compliant. It may give the buyer a sense of comfort. On the con side, which I'll jump to right now, it may give the buyer a false sense of comfort, because just because you're signed up for EVerify now doesn't mean that the majority of your workers or even, any of your workers have been run through if you have a legacy workforce. So something to be careful about in the context of an M&A transaction. There's a lot of components that need to be looked at. Just by saying you're using EVerify is not enough. Again, another pro, if you're using EVerify, you should be able to be compliant with federal contracts, and particularly helpful when combined with a solid, compliant I-9 system. In terms of cons, again, the biggest con is that you may have this false sense of security in that you are running individuals through. Just because you get an employment authorization does not mean that the person is who they say they are. So there's issues with identity problems with EVerify. For example, if there's no photo match, there are photo match of what we call List A documents, so passports and green cards and employment authorizations. You're going to match someone's photo to their document. But generally speaking, other List B documents, there is no match on. There's driver license data that might be matched up. But if you don't look at the person and look at the identity, and they're, Leon is not Leon, he's using his brother's identification, he could pass through EVerify if he has his social security card and everything matches up. So be careful of people like Leon presenting.
And that's right, Dawn. That's not an outlier. I mean, that's a pretty common phenomenon where employees are able to obtain pretty authentic looking documents, and then, unless you are a fraudulent document expert, you as an employer are not only not going to pick it up, but you're actually not expected to pick it up.
That's right, because you don't have to be a document expert. We're not document policemen. You have to use what we call the reasonable person standard. I mean, you should have some training, right? You should be able to identify everyone on this call. If you're looking at EVerify, should know what the M274 is, the employer handbook, the guide that goes along with the I-9s, and there are photos of what green cards should look like. Everybody should be able to know that when the font on a card is falling off the page or somebody's girlfriend is standing behind them in their driver's license, probably not a good document. That is, reasonable person standard. But
I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that one, but I'm sure it has happened.
I'll save one for you next time. Yeah. So these are the kind of things. Again, in terms of cons, there's a lot of additional responsibility. It's free. It's free, right? But there's a lot of training. There's a lot of processes that need to be put into place. There's oversight and monitoring, and you'll keep hearing me say this. This is not a one and done. Set it up and leave it alone. Just like all your I-9 compliance, EVerify needs to be nurtured. There needs to be good hygiene in your accounts. You need to be able to have a structure in place, no matter how small or how large you are, to continue to ensure that you're doing the right thing. There may be system errors that you need to be looking at. Integrations with your electronic I-9 system, could be problematic. And again, last but not least, which we'll talk about later on, there is information sharing that goes on between the agencies. In particular, USCIS may share information with the Department of Justice's Immigrant and Employee Rights Office that handles any discrimination claims. Next slide, please. Get through this quickly. There are, we call it the world of howevers. Yeah, the world of howevers. So, again, all good, but, right? These are the buts. The biggest but that I want you to take away from this is there's a contractual agreement that you've signed with the government in this, what we call MOU, a memorandum of understanding. Okay, take a look at it, read it. If you're gonna sign up with EVerify, make sure you read it. Sometimes I see when you have an electronic I-9 vendor in between, they're your web services provider. They're doing kind of all the sign up for you, and you may not be seeing the MOU until it's time for you to sign it. That's really a bad practice. See what you are signing up for. Make sure that you understand and you agree to it. There's some crossover on I-9, compliance type issues and what you're required to do. So super important to make sure that you're looking at that. And again, look, I've been working with EVerify since the pilot was issued in the 90s, and the beginning let's be honest. I think, Leon, probably even, maybe when you were the director, but it was definitely much, it was cleaned up, but not to the extent it is today. There was such a high number of either false positives, where EVerify would come back with the wrong information, and it was so tenuous for employees to try to correct it, or employers. But generally speaking, now the queries come back. They are generally employment authorized, and up until COVID, we were getting timely resolutions. There are some issues right now. They're not DHS's or CIS's issue. Most of the issues are coming from, unfortunately, from the Social Security Administration. And I don't know, for some reason, they're not back to work the way everybody else is. I understood there was some union issues and whatnot, but it is leaving us with a lot of open tentative non-confirmations. So, there are a lot of these howevers. You need to ensure, as I said, that we are continuing to maintain the system. Next slide, please. Yeah, and you can actually keep going. So what's voluntary, right? And mandatory. So Leon, talk to us a little bit about the federal contractor mandates.
Yeah, so for a pretty large majority of federal contractors, and their subcontractors, let me just skip right to that. The federal acquisition regulations require those federal contractors to utilize EVerify either for their entire workforce or for that segment of their workforce that is specifically dedicated to that particular contract. There are exemptions both as to subcontractors and contractors. It does not flow down for the prime for commercial or non-commercial services or construction, small contract value, and importantly, work that is done outside of the United States. Also, there are exemptions for short duration contracts, those under 120 days, certain value thresholds, etc. Next paragraph. No, next slide, I'm rather. When employers are enrolling, they must note and say what kind of employer they are.
Yeah, let's stop there for a minute.
I'm going to turn over to you and
yeah,
the details here.
We can go back here. So when we're talking about what kind of employer, like, are you a federal contractor? And if you are a federal contractor, are you subject to the FAR clause? So there are going to be contracts, as Leon, mentioned, that may not have the FAR clause in it at all, right? For whatever reason, the agency did not, put it in, or a common exemption is for what we call commercially off-the-shelf available items, COTS items. And so, if you're selling widgets to the federal government and your widgets are the same, if you're selling it to the Department of Defense or you're selling it to me at the supermarket, then there's no difference. And for those, there may be an exemption that you can be looking at. You may not want to enroll in EVerify. That said, there is something you should be looking at, why you're not enrolling in EVerify if you're doing business with the federal government. Look, this FAR clause was introduced by the Bush administration, and frankly, it was brilliant, right? It was, if you're going to do business with the U.S. government, then you need to be at the top of your game. You need to ensure that you have a lawful workforce and you're playing by the rules. And what was brilliant about it is they have this subcontractor flow down, right? So it's not only you as the prime contractor, but you need to flow it down to your subcontractors. And again, like today's webinar is not specifically to talk about FAR enrollment, but you know what? When you can, Kate, why don't you go ahead and launch the other poll, so we can kind of see what kind of employers are on the call. But once you make your decision, once you tell the government what kind of employer you are, then you also have to decide if you're going to be e-verifying the entire workforce or only those employees that are working on the contract. And that's a big question, you need to think about. Some companies cannot track it. They just cannot track who's going to be working on a contract. Now, there's also exemptions. If you're in the back office or you're in, you're doing administrative work, then you don't need to be verified. If you have a security exemption or clearance, you may not have to. So there's, all these different types of things that come into play, but there's a lot of considerations. Also, are you already enrolled in EVerify when you get the contract, or you enrolled in certain locations? Again, there's just so much that needs to be broken down. The bottom line is it's not something that needs to or that can possibly be taken lightly. It's better to structure it correctly up front and to configure it correctly. If you are using an electronic I-9 system, you better make sure it's one that understands the implications of the FAR and e-verifying in general. And again, something that is worth getting legal counsel involved, especially for larger companies. We do have a question while we're in this poll. There is a poll that hopefully you can answer. What type of e-verify employer are you? And you can check all that are applicable for your federal contractor, state mandated, STEM OPT employer, voluntary, or all of the above. We'll keep that poll open for a minute. Someone is asking us about training courses. So CIS offers EVerify training. Before you're able to log into your EVerify account, if you're a direct user, and that when I say direct user, I mean you're not using an electronic I-9 system or you're not using a third party, you have to go through an enrollment. It's pretty simple. Then you have to answer questions. You kind of click through. They ask you questions. You have to get it right. Otherwise, you go back. They ask you another question. If you're using a vendor, your vendor should be passing through those questions. I have heard of vendors that have removed those questions. Not a good idea. I definitely think that you want to make sure that the company, because at the end of the day, it's not the vendor's issue, it's going to be your issue, that you're actually going through what you need to do. That said, the vendors also do have certain compliance responsibilities. They have their own agreement with the government. So you can look at those baseline, and then CIS offers trainings on a monthly basis. They also do joint trainings with the Department of Justice, with IER. So I commend everybody to take a look at those. They're baseline. Our office does trainings as well, maybe more targeted, because sometimes it's a lot to swallow everything, to digest everything at once. So, we do targeted trainings on reporting and things like that. All right, so there we go. So we don't have that many federal contractors, and we do have a number of voluntary. All right, next slide, please. All right, so Zach, you can go to the next slide. The use of the program of EVerify at state levels varies across the board. Some states have mandates for EVerify or other similar requirements. And then on the other side of the coin, there are some states that have actually discouraged the use of EVerify. You've been working with us for a while, and you've seen state audits come and go, and you've seen how we've handled them. Let's talk to our audience a little bit about the USCIS and state EVerify.
Sure, and I noticed we have a low number of state mandated EVerify enrollers on the call, so people may be a little less familiar with this. Just starting with the illustration here, Don was talking about the baseline training that USCIS requires. This map from USCIS is their kind of official EVerify mandate map. It includes 22 states, they're in blue, and those states require EVerify for most employers. My theory is that USCIS likes trotting out this map because if we ignore where the actual population density is in the country, it looks like there's a lot more blue than gray. EVerify is kind of occupying the field. But as with so many of our compliance endeavors, the devil is actually in the details. Let's just go to the next slide. So welcome to the periodic table of EVerify mandates. Now, certain states, Florida is one example, with a newer EVerify mandate regime, they've created a carve-out where private employers may avail themselves of a document retention policy in lieu of EVerify enrollment. There are other states like Tennessee, which only requires EVerify enrollment when you're above a certain number of employees. And without going fully state by state through this map, what you should know is that this rainbow of colors here indicates the different levels that a state may have legislated or mandated E-Verify for, such as only requiring public employers, or like I said with Tennessee, above a certain number. On this map, we even point out a couple states that have rescinded or expired their E-Verify mandates. We always recommend a very careful review of state legislation based not only on where your business activities are located, but how significant your involvement is in a given state. There's no substitute for looking at the plain text of both the laws and regulations. But these state requirements can be tricky. What's your experience been so far, Dawn?
Well, I think it depends on the state itself, and in terms of what you need to turn over. Every state is different. I guess that's my experience, and you need to make sure that you're actually looking at the documents that are required and what they're asking for.
Right, and we've seen that maybe a company is not compliant because they never registered at all, or maybe they stopped using E-Verify after there was a change in HR leadership. What you were talking about earlier, how there's a lack of continuity sometimes that can create problems. Mergers, acquisitions comes to mind. And our team here, we've helped companies large and small successfully remediate many of these situations without drawing in additional state scrutiny. But what does the state scrutiny ultimately look like? It starts with a couple key considerations. You want to be sure to pay careful attention to the dates of E-Verify legislation. So we have Arizona on the map there in the bottom left. It's one of the older programs. The regulation dates all the way back to March of 2008. So this mandate has a significant effect on their auditing efforts. They'll be asking for employees hired on or after 2008. More on that in a moment. And the second thing, this map helps you draw attention to the high number of these states that have only opted to add E-Verify for public employers. So you have state governments, municipal services. There's some variety, but there are also states that have mandatory enrollment of public contractors. And you might be wondering, what can that mean? And actually, that can depend on the state. Leanne, what's been your experience with Pennsylvania?
Well, so Pennsylvania has a really interesting wrinkle to its law, which is that it has a specific E-Verify mandate for the construction industry. And the problem is that is it is sometimes what the construction industry is obvious. If you build houses and you build buildings and you're a construction worker, then that's the construction industry. But for example, that law can extend to some landscaping companies, but not others, depending on the specific nature of what that landscaping company does. So it's an example of a pretty retail twist in the law that makes it really important to thoroughly understand the ways in which states mandate this. I mean, the fact that you have such a colorful chart here sort of tells you the story, because it's not like you have 2 or 3 different flavors. In fact, there's just great variety among them.
Right, and the flavors can go both ways. There's even local kind of county-wide mandates. So Dawn, what happens if a company realizes that they're not compliant with state laws? What are the next steps?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first of all, it depends upon when you say not compliant, how not compliant are you, right? As you mentioned, we've had companies that just never signed up. They've been running under the radar. Maybe they're in Arizona and they were supposed to have been doing E-Verify for many, many years and they haven't. And then, maybe there's a change in leadership or a change in ownership and they realize they haven't. Generally, the rule on an E-Verify query is that if it was unintentional, if you missed it, if you didn't run an EVerify query and you missed it, you should be able to go back and run an EVerify query. So the reading of that, you have to be really careful about how you're going to use that. For companies that have never enrolled, there's no way you're going to be able to go back and run somebody, from 3 years ago, because your date of enrollment is the date you can actually start running employees. We've had situations where individual companies have had accounts, and maybe there's blocks of time that an HR manager, maybe the whole site didn't run, or the whole state didn't run, because maybe there was a leadership change, or so many reasons why, but they corporate thought that they were being run, they were supposed to be run. So generally what we'll do is we'll do an inventory, we'll see where the blocks are, where the holes are, and then strategically we make a decision. So the bottom line is, in some cases we can go back and run queries, but we have to think about that, whether some employees might not be active, what are we going to do with them, whether or not it's in your best interest to do that. In that case, we're going to look at the state you're in, we're going to look at the potential fines and penalties. There's a lot of considerations that we take into place, and then at the end of the day, a lot of it is a business decision. We have to look at the risks and the benefits, but there are some ways to remediate or work towards remediation. Bottom line is, companies should not ignore. Okay, move ahead.
Right. Let's talk about some more of the risks. So next slide, please. So if you can put yourself in mind of a business owner in a mandatory EVerify state, it's Monday, maybe it's Tuesday afternoon, sorting through your mail and invoices, and then you get an audit from your favorite state agency. So where do you start? Well, hopefully you have the chance to speak to an expert attorney. That's item A. But the states, you'll realize, have a lot of different agencies that have been tasked with or drawn into an EVerify oversight regime, sometimes unwittingly. So it's not always the usual suspects. Florida law actually specifically designates the Florida Department of Law Enforcement with their EVerify auditing. So that goes beyond your standard labor licensing regulators like South Carolina and Tennessee here. And these audits can lead to other actions. So consequences just from EVerify are usually being booted or disbarred, but a state government, they can fine you, as Don was saying, they can pull your business license. You'll want to be aware of that. Next slide here has a bit more information. Great. So what you really want to do first is review the state request carefully. Take it seriously. This is not just administrative. You want to only be disclosing what's asked. The other thing to be wary of, and Dawn could talk about this a little bit more, is that you're not submitting I-9 forms. You're just submitting proof of EVerify queries. This can seem a bit non-intuitive since you are putting I-9 information into EVerify, but that's not what the state's asking for, not what the state should be asking for. Dawn, do you want to talk a bit more about the I-9 data?
Oh yeah, we're gonna make it super quick.
Sure.
Federal regulations prohibit the sharing of I-9 data beyond the enforcement of the act, and generally the I-9s themselves are not to be shared. There were different states that actually sued and won and are able now to share the EVerify information. And that's why we are where we are. There was a lot of pushback when these state laws were first, coming out, including in Arizona and others. So you want to be careful. The states won't even take the I-9s. They don't want them. You're just sharing the data. Now, whether or not you share a full report, you share the case details, something that we need to be looking at. Also, if you have a full state and you're a large company, maybe you don't have to give all of the data. Maybe it's easier for you to give all the data, right? It depends upon how you're storing it. So these are all calculated things that need to be looked at.
Right. And just to wrap up here, again, you want to look at the law carefully, but you want to keep an eye on those consequences as well. Many of the states, not all of them, but many of them have listed out specific consequences. There can be increasing fines. There can be a threat to suspend your business license. They can even bar you from accepting state contracts for a year or more, depending on the severity of the violation. So that's the last thing you want to keep an eye on. I believe I'm passing it back to you, Dawn, for the next slide.
Yep, thanks. Right, so next slide. What are your EVerify obligations? it is important at the end of the day, the end game is to make sure that you're compliant if any of the agencies are coming in. As I mentioned, CAS offers not only the trainings, but they also offer job aids. There's a self-assessment guide, which is old, but still has really good information in it. There's the EVerify guide itself. There's a special guide for employers. Just go on to their website. There's a section that says, I'm an employer. That's where you want to go. You want to drop down. You can get your posters on there because you do need to notify prospective employees that you are an EVerify employer. The USCIS states that their mission in protecting EVerify against system misuse involves primarily account compliance. There is a group within the verification division at CIS. They used to be compliance and monitoring. Now they are just account compliance. And they're the ones that are tasked to look at employer non-compliant behaviors, right? They're looking for misuse, they're looking for abuse of the EVerify system, including pre-screening, running people through that should not be run through. It's getting to be a very large group. They're the ones that will contact employers and employees about potential processing errors. We don't really know what their secret sauce is. We know some of the things that they're looking at, but we know that they use a lot of artificial intelligence, but we don't know all of the targeted things that they need. Okay. Big takeaway here is CIS says that they're not directly pursuing a punitive posture. Next slide. But they do share information with the other agencies. Now, I don't think they share with IER, they'll share with ICE. I don't necessarily think that all the agencies will share with each other. IER may do a review of your EVerify account, but probably will not share it with ICE. So here it is important to know that at least what we do know about them. We know that they share information with the states. There's over 40 states that they validate driver's license information in. That's in addition to the RIDE program where they're actually matching up photos and more, well, they're matching up behind the scene information with the different agencies. So, while they're framing their assistance as being helpful, and again, I think they are in a lot of cases. They're providing you technical support. You still should know that they can do reviews. We go to the next slide. Desk reviews is one of the things that we want to take very seriously. You will get a notification. There are two kinds of reviews that EVerify does, the desk reviews and the on-site. We have not seen on-site reviews since before COVID, so we're going to focus on desk reviews. When an employer is notified about the desk review, they will come in. Well, they'll come in electronically. They will ask you for information about your account. They will look at your reporting. They will perhaps meet with certain users. They may meet with company representatives. And again, where do they get this authority? You can take a look at the MOU. All of it is in the MOU. So like I said, read it carefully, and know that if they find something in these reviews, maybe a pattern or practice, maybe you are you are running people but keeping cases open, and maybe you have these final FNCs. Again, they can refer to other agencies. So in terms of best practices, generally companies need to make sure that they are correctly registering and then updating their sites and their structures. I can't tell you how many times I get on a phone with a client and I ask to go into their EVerify account. We'll do a screen share and we go and we'll look at the account, say how many employees do they have, and it's 0 to 100, when in fact this company now has 10,000 employees. The number of sites says 2 because they signed their MOU 18 years ago, and the company has grown and nobody's updated it. You are required to ensure that you're updating the MOU. You want to make sure that you're also updating your program administrators. That is so important because those are the individuals that are going to get notifications from the government if there's any issues on any open cases or any interest in the government to closing out your account. The thing to keep in mind is EVerify accounts can be closed now because you haven't been following either of the timelines, like you have open tentative non-confirmations that you haven't addressed. They're not playing games. They'll send you a notification. They'll give you, I think, two notifications to say you have these open cases or you've not run these cases correctly. And the next thing you know, you get an email that says your account is closed and you have to go through a whole process to reopen it. Make sure your program admins are updated. Make sure you respond. If you use a web services or electronic I-9 provider, make sure that they have updated your information with the government. In addition to the best practices by companies, your SOPs, and correctly and accurately identifying those timelines, as I was talking about, are super important. Your users should all know what they are, and they should follow them. Make sure you know the rules. You have to have a photograph if you're using a List B document or a List A. If you're an EVerify employer, you need a social security number. Doesn't mean that you need it for somebody to start work, but you will need it. You will need to eventually run a query. Make sure your people are trained on the tentative non-confirmation process and they understand the privacy concerns. Make sure you're closing cases properly. Next slide. Super important to make sure that you are avoiding bad practices, right? Don't use EVerify to pre-screen, watch your policies, don't discriminate. IER in particular is looking at systems and how they may indirectly discriminate against certain classes of individuals, and EVerify could be a part of that. You want to make sure everybody is run through EVerify. You want to make sure you're not duplicating cases or closing out incorrectly. I'm going to go to the next slide. Historical reporting. A minute on this. It never ceases to amaze me that some companies never pull their reports. If you are a direct user, there's a way to go in and pull a quick report, and then there's a full report. You have to set a cadence. Somebody has to own EVerify. You cannot set it up and forget it. You have to have good EVerify hygiene. You have to know how to read the reports. You have to look for duplicate cases. You have to see if you have final non-confirmations with people that are still continuing to work for you. Why are they continuing to work for you? There's a fine if you don't notify the government, although notification may just be saying that you're allowing someone to continue to work. Somebody in leadership should have access to the system, or the report should be provided to them. Don't blame your web services provider if you don't like the reports, or you didn't know that they're reports, you weren't looking at the dashboard. At the end of the day, the government will only see you. So ensure that everyone who is supposed to have a case has a case. Make sure you're not running people that shouldn't be run. If you're doing an EVerify audit and you have missing I-9s, and then you do the I-9, don't let your system push through somebody that was hired before an EVerify audit, before an EVerify MOU is signed. All right, next slide. I want to make sure we get to this, Leon. Why don't you talk to us about the agency considerations, because it is so important, and there's so many different agencies, this alphabet soup. I want to talk about that, in particular, the DOL and DOJ.
Yeah, so you have been, and this has been going on since the beginning of time. You have various sorts of memorandum of agreement, memorandum of understanding in working relationships that are established among agencies with perhaps very similar stakeholders, but in fact very different missions. So you now have, for example, we talked about the Department of Justice Immigrant and Employee Rights section receiving EVerify data, which it then mines in order to look for particular patterns that they may think may indicate discrimination in violation of the prohibition on citizenship status discrimination, or may indicate documentary abuse of some kind, both of which, if then verified through investigation, could result in fines. But the thing that's kind of something new here, and something that really, I think, bears some particular attention, is this question of worker exploitation and the interest in using these various immigration data sources and immigration enforcement activities to in fact also look at potential worker exploitation scenarios. And you know, that isn't only, you know, really egregious human trafficking. And so it can run a broad gamut of activities. It can be very simple wage and hour violations. It could be wage theft allegations. And so the way in which these things could unfold, one, and this is you'll see in this particular slide, one of my pet theories as to how this could happen is that you have EVerify data that's being reviewed, potentially by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They see a pattern of a very large number of legal permanent residents, and they're all presenting driver's licenses. And they're all driver's licenses from states that are not the state where the employer is actually located, but they're all from that same state.
Or states that are used to be easy to get driver's license.
Or exactly.
Yeah.
And so now they know that there's a significant potential that you have a number of unauthorized workers at this employer. And the thing that very often goes with that large number of unauthorized workers is various kinds of exploitation. And so it becomes a very short distance from what becomes a suspicious EVerify pattern to what then turns into a multi-agency investigation looking at all kinds of issues, not just immigration violations, but worker abuse violations. And so, you know, does that mean that somebody shouldn't use EVerify? It certainly doesn't mean that, but what it does mean is that decisions need to be made with an understanding of what kind of employer you are, what kind of workforce you have, and what are the particular risks that go with that. And then what steps you're going to take if you use EVerify to protect yourself against these types of enforcement risks and ensure a high level of compliance. And with that, Dawn, you're going to forgive me. I need to actually move on to a call. But I want to just thank everybody for being here today. And I will wish everybody a good afternoon.
Thank you. And I think the last word on this is, you know, to EVerify or not EVerify. I think it depends, right? It's not for everyone. As you can see, there's a lot of complexity. I can't, you know, we didn't get to discuss the electronic I-9 systems, but we talked about them in various areas of the webinar. And I think this use of artificial intelligence and the way that a system, you know, especially one that's hooked up with EVerify, could be problematic in the context of a potential discrimination claim and whatnot is something they are absolutely going to be looking at and continuing to look at. So be careful, be smart. Kate, could you read the CLA code? Because I'm sure everyone's waiting for that.
Absolutely, and a huge thank you to all of our presenters. The CLE code for this webinar is SS, as in Seyfarth Shaw, 2651. That's SS, as in Seyfarth Shaw, 2651.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest.
Thank you, everyone.